What did all of these examples have in common? Well, the public sector and the private sector worked together in a partnership in which each performed at its best. The government took leadership, set high standards, and provided a nationwide mandatory framework so that everyone played by the same rules. Then the private sector responded to that signal using a classic American combination of technological innovation and market competition. The challenge of climate change, Madam President, presents us with this same opportunity, an opportunity for technology, with wind, with solar, with energy efficiency, with the potential of nuclear, with the potential of clean coal technology. It's a long list with great potential. We must meet this challenge, and we can. If we set standards for the country, the investment, technology, and innovation will follow. On the Environment and Public Works Committee, my colleagues, Senator Boxer, Senator Warner, and Senator Lieberman, have written landmark legislation to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and I'm proud to be a co-sponsor. This measure establishes mandatory, economy-wide science-based limits on carbon dioxide and other global warming gases so we can cut emissions 20% by the year 2020 and nearly 70% by the year 2050. To achieve those goals without disrupting our economy, it would establish a market-driven cap-and-trade system that provides economic incentives for reducing emissions. Now, we did the same thing with acid rain years ago, and it worked well. To make the system work, however, we need to have full and accurate information about the sources and amounts of greenhouse gas pollution. And that's what I'd like to take a few minutes to talk about today, because of the fact that this is the first title of the bill and one that I authored along with Senator Olympia Snowe of Maine. The famous British scientist Lord Kelvin felt the same way about having to measure things before you do anything. He once observed, when you can measure what you are speaking about and express it in numbers, you know something about it. But when you cannot measure it, when you cannot express it in numbers, your knowledge is of a meager and unsatisfactory kind. Believe it or not, we just don't have full, accurate information on greenhouse gas emissions right now. In fact, I was contacted a few months ago by a national public radio reporter who was trying to figure out who was the biggest greenhouse gas emitter in the United States. You would think that was something that it would be easy to find out. But in fact, it's not, because we don't have the kind of accurate information that we need. The EPA collects a lot of data on energy production and consumption, but the quantity and quality of that data varies greatly across different fuels and different sectors. For example, data on crude oil and petroleum product stocks is collected weekly from selected oil companies, while data on energy use in the industrial sector is collected only once every 3 years through surveys. In some cases, the EPA itself collects the data, while in other cases the data is collected through state or other federal agencies. Some industries report to the EPA and others report to the Energy Department. Some are reporting every year and some are reporting every 3 years. In short, it's a mishmash. Last week, the Brookings Institution here in Washington issued its own report on carbon emissions in different cities around the country. They, too, tried to make a comprehensive study, but they admitted that they could only estimate emissions from homes and vehicles, not factories or planes or railroads or government buildings. Then there are state efforts. 31 states, representing 70% of the country's population, have formed a carbon registration system of their own. It's a bipartisan project with support from governors such as Janet Napolitano of Arizona and Governor Schwarzenegger of California. Together, they recently issued a statement saying, "The state climate registries are another example of how states are taking the lead in the absence of federal action to address greenhouse gas emissions in this country." While these state projects are very well intentioned, they are a poor replacement for a national standard. Remember how Justice Brandeis in that famous decision always talked about how the states could be a laboratory of democracy. He talked about how states, one state, could have the courage to move ahead. Well, I don't think when he said that, he ever meant inaction by the federal government. But that's what we've had in the area of climate change, and that's certainly what we've had in the area of trying to measure what's going on here. Mr. President, we are never going to make progress against global climate change unless we can answer the question of how much people are emitting with greenhouse gases, where they are emitting it, and until we can give an answer with accurate, complete information. This problem actually plagued the European Union 2 and 3 years ago. They actually beat us in establishing a comprehensive cap-and-trade system to cut greenhouse gas pollution. But because they didn't start with a good, comprehensive registry of the sources and quantities of greenhouse gas emissions, they miscalculated their initial caps and permits and wound up wasting a lot of money and time before they got their cap-and-trade system right. That is why Senator Snowe and I worked together last year to write this legislation, which is the first title of the bill, establishing a greenhouse gas registry. Now you can see what this means. It's an accurate, comprehensive data on carbon emissions. It requires reporting of greenhouse gas emissions to the EPA. It requires third-party verification. It does have exemptions for small businesses because we don't want to do anything that's too burdensome. And it also makes the data publicly available on the internet. I think we know how much people are interested in this issue, and they have a right to know about it. In addition to setting the stage for cap-and-trade solutions to global climate change, one comprehensive national registry, instead of all the states doing their own, would help the states by streamlining administration costs. It would also help business. Before long, they are going to have to start cutting their own greenhouse gas emissions, and they can't make the right investments or adopt the right technologies without having good data on their own carbon emissions. In fact, some of the nation's leading corporations have endorsed the National Carbon Registry. They include Alcoa, Boston Scientific Corporation, General Electric, NRG Energy, Caterpillar, Johnson & Johnson, Pacific Gas and Electric, and many, many more. These executives have now teamed up with some of the country's leading environmental groups, including the Nature Conservancy, the National Wildlife Federation, and the Natural Resources Defense Council, to form the U.S. Climate Action Partnership. They recently issued a statement calling on the federal government to quickly enact strong national legislation to require significant reductions of greenhouse gas emissions. They took this historic step because they understood the threat of climate change and they recognize the need for federal action. These leaders are right. The time has come for us to act. As I close here, Madam President, I think about the challenges of this historic challenge. And I like to recall a prayer from the Ojibwe people, Minnesota. Their philosophy told them that the decisions of great leaders are not made for today, not made for this generation, but for those that are 7 generations from now. That is part of our burden and part of our challenge as we approach this climate change issue. That is why today I urge my colleagues to support cloture on this bill, to not only start measuring what the problem is, but to actually give this country and this world a solution. Thank you, Madam President, and I yield the floor.